Yeah, it's now good afternoon, isn't it? Good afternoon, everybody. I mean, yesterday when I was introducing myself, I pointed out that I work for the Center in Indigenous Knowledge Systems. It's in South Africa, the University of KwaZulu-Natal, the hub. It's a partnership of 5 institutions, and I'm to talk and give this background so that I connect with what I'm going to talk about African Indigenous Knowledge Systems and Decolonization of Bioethics. We are 5 institutions in South Africa forming the Center in Indigenous Knowledge Systems. And as my colleague pointed it out yesterday, Dr. Chimsami, that our mandate is to preserve, protect, and promote indigenous knowledge systems. And our focus areas are traditional medicine, food security, management, including climate change and curriculum involvement in IKS. We're doing those through research, postgraduate training, networking, knowledge brokerage, and also community engagement. So the whole aspect is the fact that Africans in their diverse cultural and ecosystems where they live, over time they manage to develop knowledge systems, including moral values, which guide them in their relationship with one another and also in their relationship with other forms of life. That's why the issue of morality or ethics, what we are dealing here and what Larry said yesterday, the love for life, is one of the central issues in our mandate of protecting, preserving, and also promoting African indigenous knowledge systems. I don't know how to go through. One important aspect in my discussion here is the question that how do we use these African indigenous knowledge systems, which our center and other structures within and outside South Africa are protecting, to mitigate the challenges which face society now, especially, as I said, we have a problem of crisis in Africa, reflected in issues of increasing corruption, issues of poverty, human rights violation, inadequate, poor basic services, including public health care. How can we use African moral thought, African ways of knowing, value systems to mitigate these aspects? Africa, like other non-Western countries, went through the problem of colonization and other forms of imperialism, and these also brought their own ways of thinking, ways of knowing, value systems, including how to deal with one another and how to relate with the natural environment. And that's what I call in my discussion here the problem of moral imperialism. That we have through colonialism in South Africa, the whole issues of apartheid, racial discrimination, the way to look at relations between people, relations between other forms of life are part and parcel of that we call moral imperialism. In other words, what I'm trying to say here is the fact that in the struggle to mitigate issues of inequality, poverty, injustice, as colleagues were trying to analyze or to interrogate it, the issue of moral imperialism, the issue of colonialism should not be underestimated. But the issue here is also the fact that there are divergent views as should we treat imperialism as a moral issue or as a bioethical problem in regions of the world like Africa. There are those people who believe that if you look at Africa and other non-Western countries, Western knowledge systems, including moral values, dominate. You look at issues of dealing with one another in terms of what they call the love for life from a Western perspective. And this issue needs also to be taken into account in the fact that imperialism or moral imperialism, to look at within the context of discussion, is a bioethical problem. And also, if you look at in terms of research and other aspects, you find that most of the literature in Africa, most of the research values and ways of knowledge production are still dominated by Western knowledge systems. So in this case, you find that imperialism, or moral imperialism to be specific, is a bioethical issue. And I find that I also gave a number of empirical examples and reasons why moral imperialism is a bioethical issue. A number of studies have been done in different parts of Africa, and those who conducted the research came to the idea or to the conclusion that when you talk to different respondents or participants in the research they carried out, you find that the problem, there is also a balance there between the research interests of the funders, who are mostly Western funders, and the interests of the community. And also you find the question of consent in terms of information. You don't know who is the final person to give consent, whether it is the individual who is supposed to give the information as the head of the household, whether it is the head of the community, whether it's a district. So those things are also need to be treated as moral issues in the research process, which is also dominated by Western values. And there is also lack of clarity on the issue of whether individuals feel sufficiently empowered to differ from community level consent obtained from a leader. Suppose the chief says this, am I supposed, or do I have the power to give an individual my own position as far as the research process is concerned? And there is also a complaint, sometimes communities feel they're too over-researched and have no say. Different researchers from within and outside the country coming to look for the same information, and the community has no say. And at the same time, there is a problem of the funders themselves. How do you reconcile the interests of the funders and the interests of the community? But there are those also who argue, and some of the arguments we had them yesterday here, who argue that it is not proper to treat imperialism as a bioethical issue, because treating imperialism as a bioethical issue complicates in our effort to deal with issues which are a global challenge. Issues like HIV, that affects everybody. And there's some people said we need to educate people to see that there are limitations in the way as traditional healers or community knowledge holders in dealing with some issues which are universal. And that is also the problem of imperialism or imperialism. When they came to Africa and the other Western countries, they don't say directly that their values are more superior than those of the local people, but they tend to give the impression that these Western moral issues and ways of knowing are universal. And you, as an African or an Indian or a Chinese, if you divert from those universal values, they tend to look at you, they can even exclude it out of the research community. So they have this argument that moral, bioethical issues are universal. So bringing other cultural sensitive issues, you are trying to complicate the issues which are supposed to be dealt in a universal way. At the same time, they argue that when you bring cultural sensitivity in bioethical or moral issues, you are also dividing humanity. Human beings supposed to think in the same way. Knowledge is universal. Knowledge has no cultural or ecological specificity. Knowledge is knowledge, but when they talk knowledge, they mean the Western world. But look at Western world as a universal way of knowing, a universal world system. And also they say by criticizing Western moral and knowledge systems as imperialism, is also the same way we should also treat non-Western values into Western countries also as another form of imperialism. At the same time, there are other people who say that we need to look at this, what the whole seminar is or workshop is about here, or colloquial conference, the fact that we need to look at the world as composed of different knowledge systems, polystemic, you could call it, and knowledge systems are supposed to be complementary rather than competitive. So we need to learn from one another. Yesterday, people were looking and going to look at the question of Ubuntu as an African philosophy, where there is a symbiotic relation between humans and the other forms of life, although it manifests itself in a different way in India or in China, but those are some of the values also in most indigenous communities, whether it's in America, in Australia, in Africa. We look at that there's a symbiotic relation between human beings and other forms of life. So those are some of the issues where there are contestations, divergent views with regarding to how do we treat imperialism as a form of bioethical problem. And my paper argues that in spite of recognizing those divergent views on morality and bioethics, there is need to decolonize African bioethics in Africa. In the sense that although the issue of decolonization in Africa is not a new thing, because a number of African scholars, people like Claude Ake, most of you don't know about some of this. So you look at the issue of decolonization, the social sciences, Guguathiong in Kenya and Chiwenzu from Nigeria look at the issue of decolonization of politics. Others look at it in the African philosophy, others look at it in the issue of psychology. They look at it in terms of disciplines, that disciplines in Africa, they need to be decolonized because these things, disciplines were imported into Africa from a Western perspective. So we need to look at also these issues from our own indigenous knowledge systems. But there are other people also who argue that the colonization of bioethics cannot be treated in the same way like other disciplines, because it includes in terms of theories, in terms of principles, in terms of institutionalizations. Most of the bioethical values in Africa are funded by donors, and they want, as I pointed out in empirical research, that this thing should be done in the way donors want, whatever. So the decolonization of bioethics in Africa, because of the nature it was imported or exported into the continent, including institutionalization, must also involve the change of institutionalization of bioethics. At the same time, it must also take into account the global challenges facing bioethics in the world, because the impact of globalization presents new bioethical challenges with serious global implications. If you look at the issues of pandemics like HIV, AIDS, the issues of organ trafficking, climate change, malnutrition, obesity, corruption, all these aspects have global implications and have also bioethical implications. So in the process of decolonizing knowledge systems or bioethics in Africa, we must also look at how these global challenges have impacted on these moral values. And also another important aspect is the fact that there is need for Africans to develop their own bioethical values based on their ethical traditions and cultures reflecting ethical problems, dilemmas facing Africans in their different cultural and ecosystem they live. It is only when bioethics is culturally sensitive that it is authentic, free of external domination, whether subtle or not. And contemporary bioethics is accused of being accused of being dominated by Western values, research program, concepts. So there is need also Africans to develop their own bioethical values to guide their relationship among themselves and other forms of life. And in this process, they must also take into consideration the silent features of African moral thought. That they pointed out that before colonization, Africans had their own ways of dealing with one another, had their own ways of dealing with other forms of life, and especially our philosophy, what we call Ubuntu, which is Ubuntu. It's a philosophy, African philosophy, which emphasizes the symbiotic relationship between humans and other forms of. It was pointed out yesterday here when people were discussing about the eco-sensitiveness about morality in the Indian philosophy, that we are there not to live in harmony with nature, we are not there to exploit nature. But when Western liberalism, emphasis on individualism came into Africa and other parts, they put emphasis on the what? On the issue of the individual. Whereas in the Ubuntu philosophy, which is manifested, called different names in different parts of the continent, they put emphasis on the question of the community. That I am because we are. In other words, you recognize your humanity through other people. Okay? That is the most important thing in the moral value of African society. Nobody will support you against your family. Nobody will support you against the community. So we find also, a colleague were discussing the concept of justice. I think when we discuss issues such as those, the cultural values must also be taken into consideration. Justice is not a neutral aspect. There are cultural, also place-based conceptualization and understanding of justice. So in the African philosophies, I'm not talking Africa as a village, I'm talking Africa as a continent with different cultures, knowledge systems, but there are certain tenets, there are certain silent features which bring Africans together as Africans. And the question of the community is central to African philosophy and dealing with one another. The community comes first, and you realize your humanity through the value of others. That's why also there is this misconception that people propagate that African sort of moral philosophy, African thought is a religious thought. That is also questionable in the sense that although we have indigenous African religions, but we don't have revealed religion like you have perhaps in Hinduism, Islam, or Christianity, whereby there's somebody who got message from somewhere, from where, and everybody can't question that. African religions are pragmatic in the sense that if a deity or a god does not fulfill what society expects, you can also question something. Yeah. So the question also looking at the number of studies which have been done in different cultural groupings in Africa to show that the moral value, the moral thought of some cultural groupings are totally independent of religion. They are based on what society considers to be wrong or right, and that is not an individual thing, it is a cultural and community-based aspect. And another important aspect in the moral aspect of African thought is the character of a person. There are a lot of studies which show that in most African languages, that's why the issue of the language is very important in the conceptualization of what dominates Western knowledge, that we tend to look at things from the way English or Latin or whatever the language you look at it. The culture of the language is very important, and in African language, most of the African language, we don't have a concept of morality, the way you read it in ethics, whatever. The most important thing is the character of a person. When you say this guy is not a human being, it doesn't mean that he is not human, but his character does not deserve to be a human. The concept of a person, in most African languages, the concept of a person is not the way you understand it. There's a normative value that this guy is not a person, this guy is not a human being. In other words, he does not deserve, in terms of if you are a cheat, you are a thief, you are cruel to other people and other forms of life, they are looking at you as a person. That you as a person, you are not a person who deserves, because you are doing things which does not deserve for a person to do as a human being. So that's why the concept Ubuntu means human, that if you do contrary to what a human being is culturally and in that particular place expected to do, you don't deserve to be like that. So the most important is the fact that we need to liberalize, or we need to decolonize African values and moral ethics on the basis of the salient features of African thought. That Africans in the different cultural ecosystems and cultural areas they live, they have developed their own ways of looking at how to deal with one another, how to deal with other forms of life, and those should form the basis of what we call bioethics or moral thought. At the same time, through dialogue, through intercultural communication, we come to realize that there are certain similarities, and the difference, in other words, diversity enriches knowledge, and also diversity should be seen as an asset rather than be looked at a problem. I think I stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arunas Discussant. Thank you. Excellent.
I think you spoke very well, and it is only because of domination of the Westerners there has been oppression, denigration and derision through slavery, colonialism and apartheid tendencies, and the African people have been affected by the inferiority complex, which is not just in Africa but also in India. Because of the British domination, there was what you call inferiority complex, with which we all suffered from. Maybe generations together that people suffered from. And it also had resulted in internalizing negative and distorted images projected by the colonizers. We thought we are not good human beings at all, and we were treated mostly like animals or slaves. So the same thing, when you had mentioned about Africa, I think it's the same. And the new bioethical challenges and globalization is also, it's a negative aspect which you mentioned, because you were not allowed to make your own bioethics, your own traditional ethics, but it was dominated by the Western concept, because that is the contemporary bioethics which is dominated by the Western values, and it was not allowed to, it didn't allow you to make use of your own values, your own religion and your own morality. It is only bioethics which was introduced, which is dominated by the Western values, so people were a bit confused, and because of the contradictions that they were not able to accept bioethics, because it is regarding treating imperialism, is it not? So, and after your education and funding of research programs, I think after the poverty problems were neglected and which was deleted, that the African tribes, because of their language and because of their religion, they were able to, some of them were able to understand, if not ethics and morality, but with character, because that was something that you mentioned, which is very important. And your indigenous philosophy, which will not be considered as a marginal philosophy anymore, but it will be the major, the central philosophy that people will believe in, and ethical conduct will also be definitely encouraged, and people will definitely become moral, and then they can combine their own ethics with Western bioethics. So it must be, they must be given chance, and I think they will improve. That is what your paper mentioned, and I think if anybody wants to make any questions, they can ask questions.
Thank you very much, Professor, for a very nice presentation. We really enjoyed it, because now we see a lot of parallels between India and Africa, so that made me to think a lot. Very rightly you have pointed out how the Western medicine or the Western outlook has degraded the indigenous values. That's a very well said by your paper, in your paper. When you are talking, I was reminded of Edward Said's well-known book, Orientalism, wherein he makes a distinction between the indigenous people or those who are colonized and the colonizing people. How the indigenous people, though they have got, the colonized people, though they have got knowledge, that has not been accepted by the colonialism. Taking this as a background, I would like to tell you that the indigenous medicine, for example, in India, we have got two important medicines which we are practicing. One is Ayurveda, which is developed in Kerala, and another is the Siddha medicine. Our expert is coming now. So these two are very indigenous and they are very much relevant in the modern context. For example, recently the whole country was affected by dengue fever, and the best medicine we gave was this Nilavembu Kashayam. In Tamil we call it, it's a sort of herbal. But this is not acceptable to allopathy doctors. Some of them are very allergic towards this sort of usage of this Nilavembu Kashayam. This means there is always a tension between this and the indigenous medicine and the allopathic medicine. And most of the time it is neglected by them. They are not taking it very seriously. This is a very dangerous position because of the Western influence or the Western medicine's influence. I say that this problem is very much persisting, especially in India. I think the same is in the other country also. But you are making a reference to the trans-cultural dialogue. Now, I have some problem with that. Because now I feel that whether it is Asian, your African culture or Indian culture, we have our own method of identifying the disease and curing the disease. So why, if we apply this methodology of trans-cultural dialogue, then our values, our indigenous values, our cultural values will be lost. I am afraid of that. Why we should do that? And another problem is that language sometimes is a barrier, because we are not, because most of our literature in India, I would say either it is in Tamil or in Sanskrit or in Malayalam. This has not been translated into English, so that the Westerners also the Western medicinal practices can also be benefited. What is your view on this?
Yeah, I give you an example. Especially in the case of South Africa. South Africa is a multicultural society. People live together in a society. You've got Indians, Shimaji is Indian, but she's South African. You have Europeans, they're also not homogeneous. You've got Italians, you've got Dutch, you've got English, you've got Germans in the same society. You have also, African themselves. We're not a village. South Africa is the second largest continent in the world with I don't know how many countries and cultures. So we live in a society where diverse cultures. And there was a time in Africa, in South Africa in particular, when people talk of indigenous knowledge, what they only had in mind was African indigenous knowledge, not knowing that, as you are pointing out, Indians are also not homogeneous. We have Muslims, we have Hindus, all cultures, and each of them has its own indigenous knowledge systems. So what we are trying to, why we are promoting, in the case of South Africa, where we have people from Asia, from Africa, and from Europe, we started a project, it's part of it now, what we call a triple heritage, a society with a triple heritage. So we are going in a problem-oriented way. Let's say we have a problem of teenage pregnancy in the society. How do the Muslims think about it? How do the Hindus approach it? How do the Zulus approach it? How do the Swanas approach it? In other words, we have a common social problem in society, and we pull different knowledge systems to see how do we sort out that problem as the community. Same thing here. When you are talking about the core what? I mean, yesterday you were discussing about core consciousness.
The eco-consciousness.
Yeah, I mean, you come to realize that what you are saying is the same thing what we do in Ubuntu as a African philosophy, which was also called different names in different parts of Africa. So you find through this transcultural dialogue, they find how knowledge become complementary. We are now talking with some of the guy colleagues here to do research, comparative research, to see how do these different ways, let's say mental health and indigenous knowledge, how do the Japanese deal with the traditional knowledge and mental health? How do the Koreans deal with traditional knowledge and mental health? How do Africans in their different cultural diversities deal with it? So through such dialogue, we come to know that there might be more similarities, but the difference is more apparent than real. The difference might be in appearance, not in essence, as the philosopher, the professor was saying it. So through that complementarity of knowledge systems, because if you look at the history of South Africa with apartheid and westernization brought this idea that when cultures live together, it becomes a problem. While we are promoting the fact that the diversity of cultures is an asset rather than a problem. So when you talk of transcultural dialogue, what there is promoting here, is to see how do we, through transcultural dialogue, interaction, can we promote bioethics. So we are not looking at cultures interacting or in a process of dialogue as a problem. It becomes an asset. It's a philosophical way of looking at it. We have problems facing society, HIV, problems of teenage pregnancy, drug abuse. How do different cultures, different knowledge systems look at that problem in a global context? Yeah.
And from what you spoke, even my understanding is that the spread of HIV/AIDS has been greater not only in South Africa but also in India and in Tamil Nadu.
The president of the university was telling me that he's dealing with HIV/AIDS.
We are the ones who are having what you call majority of the people are affected by HIV.
Yeah, it's a global issue. Yeah.
That I think you have mentioned, and that's what I'm trying to say, that it is also common in India and more in Tamil Nadu.
Yeah.
So I would like anyone else who would like to ask questions.
Thank you for your inspiring talk. My question is also similar to what we've been discussing here. It's about how we should represent the past history. To what extent do you think the Western value and knowledge system affect the way African people construct their identity and bioethics in today's society? Because we've been talking about the different view of life and death and Asian bioethics, African bioethics, but is there such a thing as African bioethics, or what's the... Because if we stick to it, the Japanese way or Korean way of thinking, then it's become dogmatic, then it would be suffering, I think. So what's the...
Okay, I understand what I was saying. I'll give you one example. I lived in Germany for almost 20 years. My neighbor when I was a student was a colleague from South Korea. He was doing philosophy. So one time we were cooking together in the kitchen and we started an argument. He was also a student of philosophy student. And the argument came to the point that he says, as far as he knows from Korea, Africans had no history before the coming of Europeans. You see what I'm saying? And that is not, he's not the only one, and most other people think that way, who are outside Africa. They think Africans, before colonization, we lived like monkeys or whatever. You see what I'm saying? So those are type of people. I mean, I'm talking now here in the 21st century, 20th century when I was still in Germany. People think in those ways. So it is through such dialogues that we also rewrite history. And also people don't understand, if you go in the history of ideas, I mean the contribution of Africa into the global knowledge, the contribution of Asia, the contribution of different other non-Western countries in the global pool of knowledge, especially Africa. Not to what is now Greek knowledge, most of them came from Egypt, and Egypt is not in Europe. Egypt is in what? In Africa, you know something. But all those knowledge systems which Africa contributed, I was telling one of my colleagues that in the 14th, 15th century, when Europeans were living in trees or whatever there, Africans had already big universities like Timbuktu and others in Algeria, whatever. But all those things have been wiped in history. In other words, the contribution of African in science and technology, and some of these in medicine, in all different areas, are not part of history.
Yeah.
So it is our right now as African scholars, working with other colleagues, to rewrite African history, to promote the contribution of Africa into the global pool of knowledge. And that's why, through working together, we come to realize that, for instance, the trade between the East African coast and China and India went even before Christ. There are so many artifacts now being excavated by archaeologists to show that there was a link between India, China, and other parts of the world before the coming of Europeans or European civilization. But all those things are not known. And it is our responsibility, and that is the responsibility of my center, to ensure that we contribute this new knowledge to the global pool knowledge, so that we change the mindset with the rest of the world has about Africa and the African people.
That's not a question. Actually, I would like to cross-reference with Professor Aruna. You told bioethics that is particularly Western-based. In fact, a book that was published in 1994, edited by Ranan Gillan, in the different articles of this book, they want to say the full principalism that was offered by Peacham and Tudis in their books, The Principle of Biomedical Ethics. Actually, that very four principles that was first explored by the Islamic scholar Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi. He was from Afghanistan, you know. Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi, he was a Sufi poet, and in his different writings, he, on the basis of Quran and Hadith, he spoke about the principles of autonomy, beneficence, justice, and many things like that. So we may claim that the basis of the principles of biomedical ethics, what we are claiming, the Western biomedical ethics or bioethics, actually the basic foundations were come from the East. Jalaluddin Rumi was the first exponent of this line of thought. This is the cross references. Maybe you can accept or not. Therefore, and the point to the professor, Hassan, am I right? Okay. You are talking about the colonization, post-colonial theory, decolonizations. I have also some interest on decolonizations. But can I ask you, is it a theory or a process, or the process of reactions? Suppose we are talking about the colonial processes. You know, most of the former colonies, they made lot of injustice, genocide, transatlantic slavery trade, racialization, so system of slavery, and a lot of abuse were happened by these colonial forces, and also economic discrepancy have been done by these people. So, if we are going to the process of decolonizations, while we are not claiming this colonial power to bear the money, to bear or retributive justice for what they were happened or what they were done in the colonial area, as Professor Aruna told about the colony on India, and there are also colony of France and Britain on Caribbean countries. And there are a lot of misoccurrence and abuse. So if we started decolonization, firstly we have to decolonize our thought from that may be westernized thought or any other powerful thoughts. Otherwise it's quite impossible to be decolonized. Either it would be only theory or doctrine. So if we go out from these doctrinal approaches, firstly we have to go out into the process. Is it okay?
No, I mean, the colonization is a process.
Yes.
The process is not something which happens today. It's not an event. It's a process. And you said rightly, most of the African writers, when I gave you a number of writers like Woodward Young, talks of the colonization of the mind.
Yeah.
The colonization of the language we use in articulating our thoughts. Those are important aspects also, in the sense that we need also to change our minds, because one important thing what colonialism, imperialism did in African or in non-Western country was to go into our what? Into our mind. We think like Europeans, we speak at Western values, I mean, in those. So the most important way that academicians and scholars, that's why we do research, we ensure that research goes into teaching, and we teach being guided by our own ways of knowing. That we had a history, we had our own ways of dealing with ourselves and other forms of knowledge. That's why the core question of the mind. We need to decolonize our institutions.
Yes.
That's why South Africa is one of the first countries perhaps in the world with an indigenous knowledge policy. And our institution, the University of KwaZulu-Natal, will be the one institution in the world with an institutional indigenous knowledge policy. All our programs, whatever, must have the aspect of indigenous knowledge to ensure that the students in natural sciences, students in the humanities, they are also equipped with African social thought. We look at the laboratory from an African perspective, the community, the theory, the measure between theory and practice based on African values, whatever. So it is a process. And the question we're talking about, perhaps the compensation, we're talking about, there are people in Latin, in the US, whatever, in Africa, they are pushing that movement. That there must be because of slavery, because of slave trade, because of exploitation of our resources, which is still going on here. We're going to economics, a two-way model, where we produce what we don't consume and consume what we don't produce. They take our minerals, process them in Europe and in America, and they sell us expensive stuff which most of people can't afford. So all those injustices, the amount of money, the aid we get from outside is less than what the money is being taken out of the country. So there are certain movements, as I say, it's a process, not an event. People also pushing that there must be compensation for slavery, slave trade, and also to ensure that the resources which are being exploited remain in the continent for the benefit.
Okay, do you think that we need
Excuse me, sorry. Before we conclude, I think indigenous knowledge system was not allowed, and that was not possible for them to propagate and spread and bring about what you call an understanding of African bioethics, which can be combined with the Western idea of bioethics.
You can't be a colonialist and a democrat at the same time.
That is what he said.
Thank you very much.